My name is Marilyn Castriota. I'm the Community Engagement Manager with Kestrel Land Trust, and we are based in Amherst, Massachusetts. The mission of Kestrel Land Trust, as many of you know, is to conserve and care for forests, farms, and riverways in the Connecticut River Valley of Western Massachusetts, in doing so while nurturing and enduring love of the land. Tonight's event is the third in our Conservation Action for Biodiversity online speaker series. Shelby Perry, Wildlands Ecologist at Northeast Wilderness Trust, will be presenting, and her presentation is called Wildlands, the Cornerstone of Ecological Resilience. We are delighted to partner with Northeast Wilderness Trust. And so all of you know, Kestrel Land Trust Executive Director Kristen DeBoer does serve on its board of directors. I'm pleased that Monica and Bob Leverett are in attendance tonight. In 2018, they created the Monica and Bob Leverett Forever Wild Fund at Kestrel Land Trust, which is dedicated exclusively to conserving forests as forever wild. Their goal is to preserve wildlands that are on their way to late successional status in order to capitalize on their ecological benefits and to maximize their advanced rates of carbon sequestration in order to help mitigate climate change. I've put a link in the chat so that you can learn more about them and their fund. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Shelby Perry. Shelby works for Vermont-based Northeast Wilderness Trust. She holds a BS in Environmental Engineering from RPI, a Master of Science in Plant Biology, Field Naturalist from University of Vermont, and has a deep love and respect for wild places. As wildlands ecologist, she built Northeast Wilderness Trust's ecology program, focusing scientific research efforts on the ecology of the wild places that Northeast Wilderness Trust protects. So welcome, Shelby, and I'm now turning it over to you.
Thank you, Marilyn, and thank you, Kestrel, for having me. I'm delighted you're all here tonight on this beautiful evening. I didn't think very many people would want to look at a screen, but I promise you lots of really pretty pictures of nature during my presentation. So just give me 1 second to get my screen, my presentation booted up here. Hopefully you can all see that. So like Marilyn said, I'm Shelby Perry. I work at Northeast Wilderness Trust based in Vermont. And I'm here today to talk about wildlands and their contribution to biodiversity. I know this is a regular Zoom meeting format and not a webinar, so you can put things in the chat while I'm going, and feel free to show me your faces and smile and react, so I'm not just talking to a wall. But if you'd like to keep your cameras off for your privacy, also that's fine with me. So I'm going to get started. I have a little agenda here. I like to have guiding questions more than a strict agenda. And so I thought we would start by kind of going over what is rewilding. So there's my guiding questions. And then we'll talk about what are wildlands. So we're all kind of on the same page about this vocabulary that I'm going to use throughout. And then I'll talk about what these things mean for biodiversity in our sort of eco-region and in the Northeast broadly, and then why you should care. And hopefully by the end of my presentation, you'll be able to answer all of these questions, and then I will have done my job. So first up, let's begin at the beginning. What is rewilding? This is probably going to be review for some of you. You probably are familiar with this history, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, rewilding began in the 1980s with members of the grassroots organization Earth First. And it ends with an exclamation point, so you have to say it like that, Earth First. It originally referred to a conservation strategy of protecting the 3 Cs. That is cores, which are large protected wildlands, corridors, which are sort of the areas of natural cover interspersed with human settlements that allow connectivity between those cores, and carnivores for their outsized impacts on the ecosystems that they are part of. I'm going to add a 4th because I always do every time I talk about the 3 Cs, which is coexistence, because none of the other Cs will survive unless we find room in our hearts to make space for them and coexist with them comfortably and happily. So those are the 3 now 4 Cs. Some people make the 4th C compassion, very similar reasons. And the term has sort of evolved over the years, and more recently, it's been used in a lot of contexts. Some might say too many. And so I did a recent search of the term in the news recently, and I think this sort of shows the spectrum of uses of the term rewilding today and why there might be a little confusion. So here we are with Rewilding Ireland, undoing the damage from a history of deforestation. That's about reforestation and rewilding. That's pretty on the nose. Now we're talking about rewilding the soil, urban rewilding, and restoring microfauna in the soil and urban environments. So similar, but on a smaller scale. Now it's a gardening trend for 2024, according to House Beautiful, which I think is a magazine or a website. Full disclosure, I did not read the article. And finally, how to rewild your teenagers, just in case they're not wild enough for you, which I think is important, but is a slightly different use of the term than maybe was originally envisioned. And then this last one, this really got me, rewilding the internet. I did not read the article. I don't know what they mean, but this does identify sort of the full spectrum of how this term has been used. And so I wanted to sort of focus our minds on 2 specific uses of the term in this presentation. And so one of them is active rewilding. And that's things like this project where wolves were just released in Colorado. That's carnivore reintroduction and active restoration projects. The other is passive rewilding. And passive rewilding is really about wildlands conservation. It's about letting land kind of choose the winners and losers. It's a non-intervention approach, managing by not managing the land. And that picture's from Wildwood Wilderness Preserve. That's a Northeast Wilderness Trust Preserve in southern New Hampshire. So that's sort of our intro to rewilding and what I mean by rewilding. And I just started mentioning the term wildlands. So let's move on to that question. What are wildlands? So I talk about wildlands a lot in my line of work, and I've defined them a whole bunch of different ways in the time that I've been here. But I thought I would start sort of anchoring this in some in a real piece of work, in a real effort. So here is the definition of wildlands that came out of the Wildlands report. And this was a big report that was done in partnership with Northeast Wilderness Trust, Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities. I think Highstead and Harvard Forest were all part of it. It came out pretty much exactly a year ago. And they defined wildlands as tracts of any size and current condition permanently protected from development, in which management is explicitly intended to allow natural processes to prevail with the free will and minimal human interference. Humans have been part of nature for millennia and can coexist within and with wildlands without intentionally altering their structure, composition, or function. So that's the definition as it comes out of the Wildlands report. And this definition gets at one of the most important things about wildlands to me, which is autonomy. Autonomy for nature, a place where nature directs the ebb and flow of life and humans aren't picking the winners and losers. This is also passive rewilding. So to just dive into that a little bit more, this graphic is an overview of, it's a Google Earth image screenshot of a Northeast Wilderness Trust Preserve in Maine. That green line is our shapefile of the property line, but you don't really need it there to see the edges of this property. And so I wanted to get a bit more practical with my definition of wildlands and really zoom into the specifics. And so this is Northeast Wilderness Trust definitions of wildlands, not necessarily the one used by the Wildlands report, where I just pulled that larger definition from. But we have a list of restricted uses, and that includes horseback riding and any motorized or mechanized transportation like four-wheelers and bicycles. It includes extractive uses like mining or logging. Trapping is prohibited in our properties, and forms of agriculture like crops or livestock are all prohibited on our properties. And so what's left? Well, these are places appropriate for hiking and nature study, for appreciating nature, for scientific inquiry, and we do allow on some of our properties hunting of abundant or overabundant prey species. And so that's sort of the Northeast Wilderness Trust list of restrictions. And you'll see that we have really de-emphasized recreation in that definition. And that's NEWT in particular, but wildlands in general do that to various extents. And so I wanted to illustrate why we might do that with this screenshot. This is a satellite image of just a random patch of woods in New Hampshire that I picked out. This piece looks pretty intact. I think if we all looked at this, satellite image, we would say there's some high quality habitat there, right? We've got an intact forest block. You can see a power line cut going through in the left. You can see some development to the right, but you've got a pretty big block of woods there. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the app Strava, but Strava is an app that lets people track their runs and bikes and paddles and exercise. And they put together what's called the Strava heat map, where people have tracked their routes when they're traveling to exercise. And the more a route is traveled by various Strava members, the brighter it gets on the heat map. So I'm going to overlay this with the screenshot from the Strava heat map of the same place. And you can see from this screenshot that recreation has fragmented this landscape in a way that isn't really visible from that overhead view. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I think that's wonderful for people to commune with nature and spend time out in nature. But I think one of the values of de-emphasizing recreation in certain places is that you don't get that fragmenting effect of trails and use within the forest. Try to imagine being a bear looking for a place to raise their cubs, or a coyote looking for a den site in a place like this forest, which is broken into smaller and smaller islands of habitat. So with this, we've started to look at wildlands and their implications for biodiversity of sort of the larger and wider ranging animals, which has implications for biodiversity. But I'm going to come back to this list of guiding questions and say, what do these things mean broadly for biodiversity? So I'm going to focus, I started talking about the big animals. From this point forward, I'm going to focus on some of the smaller ones and the lesser known ones, and I'll tell you why. So every state in New England has a state endangered species law that tracks rare, threatened, and endangered species within the state. because Kestrel's in Massachusetts, I pulled Massachusetts's sort of summary list here. But all the states have this, and we're generally comfortable with what animals, plants, and even some genera of insects like butterflies and bees are common and uncommon across our region and what their habitat needs are. Some states are going a little further in different places, like New Hampshire is working on a list of rare species of fungi. Maine is working hard to catalog moth and dragonfly diversity. And shout out to Massachusetts for having a sponge, a flatworm, and a segmented worm on their state endangered species in their list of RTE species, rare, threatened, and endangered. Those are not species that many, or those are not groups that many places pay close attention to. But what you can see from this list is we're looking at mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, plants, and then we have a handful of invertebrates there. But we're kind of seeing the tip of the biodiversity iceberg, so to speak. So I'll show you what I mean by that. This graphic came from a publication Northeast Wilderness Trust did a couple years ago, called as part of our Wild Work series. It was called Biodiversity, the Language of Wilderness. And this graphic is adapted from that. This is the relative abundance of taxonomic groups across the Northeast. So what you can see here is that top little red triangle, those are all our vertebrates. That's birds and fish and amphibians and mammals. That's all the big animals. And some of them are actually pretty small, but all those sort of visible animals. The next one on the list is tracheophytes. Tracheophytes are all plants with roots, stems, and leaves. So that does not include mosses and liverworts, which are in the next one, the orange block. Then below that is invertebrates. Those are insects and arachnids and things like that. And then that bottom is microbes and microorganisms. Those are so many things I can't list, protists and rotifers and all the little things that you maybe saw under your microscope at some point in middle school, swimming around with their little flagella. So all of those represent part of this cornucopia of biodiversity. And so because I want to focus on some of those lesser known things, I'm going to focus on the bottom of that pyramid for the rest of this presentation, because that piece is really important and it's not very well understood. We know we have a pretty good idea of the habitat needs of most of the species listed in our state endangered species acts and our federal endangered species acts. But when you get to these lesser known organisms, unsurprisingly, less is known. So they are really important and not really well understood. Wildlands allow forests to develop old forest characteristics. This graphic is also adapted from that Wild Works I was talking about. And this kind of shows some of the structures that old forests start to develop over time. They have been found to have a higher diversity of moss, lichen, and herbaceous plants. The minimally disturbed forests tend to have deep leaf litter and humus layers. Those provide moist and comfortable environments for a lot of decomposers and species that require moisture to move around, like amphibians and many of our invertebrates. Those segmented worms often rely on moisture. Older trees often have more cavities and holes in them. These are important denning habitat for larger animals. They're also important microhabitats for smaller animals and mosses, lichens, things like that. Seeps are small forested wetlands. These occur, it's sort of where groundwater comes out of the surface. They're more common in forests that have lower human impact. That's in large part because once a forest has been altered in a big way with logging or agriculture or road building, a lot of times we monkey with the surface water and the way water moves across. Either curtain ditches are put in or drains, or skid trails will change the hydrology, change the way the water flows on the landscape. and you don't get wetlands so much as small brooks and things like that. And then finally, tip-ups create shelter and denning for nesting animals. Over time, they decompose down into that sort of familiar pit and cradle topography that we look for in old forests. As these characteristics accrue, so do the microhabitats that many organisms rely on. Likewise, the more often a forest is disturbed, the more adapted to disturbance the residents of that forest become. So over time, with constant disturbance, we tend to shift our forest communities to only those species most resilient to human disturbances, which is a much smaller group of species than would typically be there. So I've said this several times, and now I want to illustrate it graphically. We've focused a lot in the way that we've planned for conservation and connectivity on the big animals, metaphorically represented by the frog in this photo. But I want to focus on some of those smaller things that are out there and alive. And so that's metaphorically represented by this bug that is about to be the frog's lunch. So heading from the macro to the micro, let's explore a little bit of this biodiversity. And if you know me at all, you know that I'm going to start with slime molds, which represent the bottom, the gray area on the bottom of that pyramid that I showed. And from here, we'll work our way up those other groups that I talked about. So slime mold is in kingdom Protista. It's a protist. It looks like a fungi in this picture. It looks like a fruiting mushroom, but it's a protist. It's a large multi-nucleus bag. It's like a cell with many nuclei. And when it's in its sort of mobile phase, it's called a plasmodium, and it crawls around on the forest floor. It hunts. It's a predator. It eats other slime molds and lots of other microorganisms. And then eventually, when conditions are right, it fruits. And we're looking at some fruiting bodies here on a piece of moist, rotting wood. And I want to give you something for scale here. So I added my finger to the photograph to show you what we're talking about in terms of size. So these guys are really tiny. This one species in particular is, I think, an Arceria species. I don't know exactly which one. They're pretty hard to key out directly to species. There are around 1,000 described species in the world, but more are being described every day because not many people looked before, and still not many people are looking. So people who are paying attention are finding new things all the time. I mentioned that plasmodium, so you might have seen them in the woods. If you go out on a rainy day and you see a leaf wet on the leaf litter and it's got veins of slime going across it, that's a slime mold, probably a plasmodium. They travel in these sort of veins. They're studied for cellular streaming because it's one big cell and they move. This picture doesn't really show the plasmodium very well because this one is starting to sporulate. So this is the phase where it's starting to lift up and make its fruiting bodies. You can see the shine in the out of focus area of the photo. That's sort of the slime trail from its slimy phase, why it's called a slime mold. And it's about to be in its pretty phase, the fruiting phase. There's two species in this photo, and I wonder if you can all see them. I'll let you look for a minute, and then I will explain where they are and what we're looking at. So in the foreground, you can see some moss and some out of focus white blobs, and kind of down to the left, there's an in focus white blob. That's a slime mold. And then arcing across the top is a dried leaf. I believe it's a maple leaf, but I don't know for sure. And on the stem of that leaf, there's some little marching organisms, those little gray blobs. Those are a different fruiting slime mold. So you have two fruiting slime molds here. I can't tell you what species are on the petiole of the leaf, but I can tell you the one in the bottom left is Serratiomixa fruticulosa. That is it's honeycomb coral slime mold is its common name. This is one of the most common and most unique slime molds. How many people knew there's something that looks like that out in our forests? I mean, that's just wild. It looks like a sea anemone to me. Each one of those little fingers has on it, and you can almost see it in sort of the edges, especially the bottom right, where there's almost like freckles on it. Each of those is an individual spore born on an individual stalk on the outside of this slime mold. So this one fruits in a unique way. Many of them, like this Trichia species, fruit more like a mushroom with a stipe or a stem, and then a fruiting body at the top. This is called a sporotheca. And inside they have this capillicium material, and that's the sort of stringy stuff you see sticking out. That helps to fling the spores when they dry and the outer part erodes away, and that's how they reproduce. And here's one more image of a slime mold looking a little bit like scrambled eggs, and this is scrambled eggs slime mold. So they have really fun common names as well. I think so. So now we're going to move up a layer in that pyramid of biodiversity that I was talking about, and we're going to get into the invertebrates. And I chose a group that's pretty ubiquitous, but really often overlooked. And so I chose springtails for this one. I took this picture in the spring in a vernal pool, and the springtails, I think, had just sort of gotten stuck on the surface of the water and had to wait for a breeze to blow them over to this little twig where they could climb out. They are so light and so small that they can almost walk on the surface tension of the water, but they're not very graceful walkers. So they kind of have to wait to be pushed around to get out of the water. So I've always loved to explore sort of the edges of what we know, hence my love of slime molds, and now my appreciation for springtails. And when I find little things like this, I always want to dig into that. These springtails, they're of the order Collembola, and I might even be saying that wrong. I don't know where to put the emphasis. I don't usually say these words out loud. They're omnivorous, free-living organisms, and they prefer moist conditions. So they really like that leaf litter, those deep humus layers that I was talking about accruing over time in old forests. The kind of springtails that you all might be most familiar with are called snow fleas. Here they are not shown in the snow, but the rain. I actually took this picture because of the raindrops, and then I got home, and it wasn't until I looked at it later that I realized that that leaf is covered with little springtails. These are snow fleas. It's one species of springtails. Springtails is a much bigger group. I looked up online and I got two different numbers from two different sources. There are either around 6,000 species or somewhere around 3,600 species worldwide. My guess is that there are about 3,600 described, but estimated 6,000. Snow fleas are no relation to the kinds of fleas that infest dogs and bite them and drink blood. They are, they're not decomposers exactly, but they do interact with decomposition in that they regulate decomposer populations. They spend a lot of time in that leaf litter, and they eat and break down organic matter and other decomposers. They're called springtails and fleas because of their jumps, but that's a little bit of a misnomer. There is no spring on their tail. They jump, and you've probably seen this if you've seen them on the surface of snow in the winter time, where they seem to be somewhere and then they just are gone. They just disappear. And that's because they jump with an appendage on their abdomen called a furcula. This is it's almost like a lever that they can swiftly fill with fluid, and it springs out and it shoots them up into the air many hundreds of times their body length. And then in their tail end, they have an appendage that is like a little sticky tripod that extends out of their rear end and helps them stick to the substrate when they land. And that prevents them from just sort of bouncing on forever. So springtails is really a misnomer. I advocate that they should be called spring belly sticky butts, but it hasn't caught on yet. This is a picture that I tried to take of the underside of a mushroom, and I was working on focus stacking, so I was taking pictures in series. And so there's 5 pictures in this series, and I'm gonna scroll through them. And you can see the springtails living in the gills of the mushroom. So this is a different species of springtails. I don't know what species this is, but I do know that a mature deciduous forest in New England could host anywhere between 30 and 40 species of springtails. And a forest in the tropics might have closer to 100. They're also incredibly abundant. Estimates indicate that there are around 100,000 individual springtails per square meter of their habitat, that's soil and the substrates that they live on in the world. So on average, every square meter of the forest floor has around 100,000 springtails living in it, which is just incredible to me. In our area, there are even a few species that are exclusively arboreal, meaning that they live only in trees. They need those moist conditions. You can imagine that young trees don't have that same level of moisture and material buildup that springtails need. So it takes some time for them to be able to live, for certain ones, to be able to live in those forest canopies. Here's another picture of springtails in mushroom gills. I actually took this picture trying to get an image of the slug, which is all the way in the top left, eating the mushroom, but then I got underneath it and was so distracted by the springtails, and I ended up not getting a very good focus on any of them. But these guys are sort of debated where they belong in taxonomy, but right now they're categorized as hexapods, which is just a certain group within that sort of invertebrate part of the pyramid that I showed. So now we're going to go up to the next level, and we're going to start talking about fungi, in part because you can see that springtails use fungi as habitat. And I will also just jump back to the slime molds who eat fungi often. So those 2 smaller species, they rely on some of these other groups, and fungi can be smaller or larger. Fungi are another barely explored group. We know the big ones, and particularly the edible ones, but when it comes to the full diversity out there, there's a whole lot we don't know. This little innocuous looking mushroom is called luminescent pinellus. I had never seen it. And then one night I went for a walk. I was camping with a friend in Pennsylvania. I went for a walk in the dark up and down the road at the campground, and there were no lights. It was, you know, a rustic campground with no services. So we set up our tents, and then we went for a walk up and down the road. Nobody else was there. And on our way back, we saw a tree next to our campsite, and it was glowing. Now, this is not a very good picture because their glow is very faint. And I took this with I think a 50-second shutter speed. You really need to have eyes very adjusted to the darkness. But that was in Pennsylvania. These ones I actually found up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. They're across the entire Northeast. Luminescent pinellus is the name of this species. I don't know how they glow, but I do know it's a similar material to what is in fireflies. And they're just one of a couple of species of glowing mushrooms in our area. Mushrooms are also decomposers. They are really important in terms of living on and breaking down that coarse woody debris that starts to accumulate in old forests. And what they do is they make the nutrients in the wood available in the soil, which makes it usable for plants and things that it otherwise is inaccessible to. So a lot of species of fungi are decomposers. Some of them are, well, many of them are not decomposers. They are either affiliates of plants, meaning that they form a root to mycorrhizal connection with trees and various plants, and they go and collect and move various nutrients and minerals that are important to plants from the soil, and they give it to them in exchange for sugars that the plants make by photosynthesizing. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Some of them are also obligates of scat. So this species, you can't really tell from this picture, but is on a pile of deer scat. I don't actually know the name of this species, but I thought it was a neat photo. I do know the name of this species, which is, I believe, a decomposer. This is called eyelash cup. These are really small mushrooms. They, I think, can get as big as a dime, but usually are about half that size or smaller. And they have that nice little creepy eyelash hair around the edge of them. Here's another species of fungi, and this is one of a group called moss bells. So this is a moss bell, one of many varieties of moss bell. I don't know which one specifically, but you can see that it grows in sort of a community of other species. We've got moss, we've got lichens, there's probably some liverwort in there, and those are the bryophytes. So bryophytes and, well, lichens are separate. Lichens are fungi, or fungi and algae in a symbiotic relationship, sometimes also bacteria. And then bryophytes refers to the rest of them, the moss, the liverworts, and things like that. Bryophytes literally means moss plants. Bryo means moss, phytes means plants. So moss plants. These are non-vascular, seedless, i.e. spore-bearing plants. So they're dispersed by spores. So we're now in that, well, with fungi, we already were in that orange layer of the pyramid that I showed earlier. But these are the other members of that layer in the pyramid. So here's a liverwort. This is a leafy liverwort. They're spore dispersed. There's about 9,000 species worldwide, and they have this crazy gametophyte dominant life cycle, which moss does too. Gametophyte dominant life cycle. That means that when a spore is released from a mature liverwort or moss, it lands on the ground, it germinates into a free living gamete. It is the reproductive cell of either male or female. Sometimes they're male, sometimes they're female, sometimes they're both, but it's a free living gamete. And 2 of those have to be connected by a film of water before you get a fully mature individual. And a lot of what we think of as moss and liverworts are actually those sort of gametophytes, those free living gametes. And then when they're actually in their sort of fully, what's the word I'm looking for? Diploid 2N, they have the genetic material from 2 parents phase, they are just a sporophyte, which is a stalk holding the spores for the next generation. And I have a picture of that briefly in a few slides. Nearly all liverworts have fungal associates, maybe all of them, which means that they also form those relationships with mycorrhizal fungi who live and connect with them. They don't usually have what we would think of as roots, but they are able to connect with fungi who trade nutrients for the photosynthate material. And they live in moist habitats in swamps, bogs, and damp forests where they grow on rotted logs or in damp soils. Some of them are aquatic. This is a leafy liverwort, just a close-up picture. And then remember I mentioned that sporophyte. So here's what that looks like. I took this picture this spring. You can see some of that leafy liverwort and some mosses in the sort of out of focus background, but you've got a stalk and that capsule on the top, and that capsule is full of spores, and those spores are what will grow the next generation of gametophytes. And so most of what we're used to seeing, here are the sporophytes of moss. These ones each collected their own little water droplet in the morning. Most of what we're used to seeing as moss, the green bits, are all the gametophytes. And those two are closely related, the moss and the liverworts. This is just a picture that I took a couple years ago of fir seedlings in a bank of moss. And what I wanted to show, you can see a little bit in the bottom of the screen, is that we're looking at rock here, rock that was colonized by moss, that was then colonized by trees. And so you can see how time helps these processes play out and these structures start to build. This is called primary succession, when you start colonizing bare rock. And moss is pretty good at that. Moss grows a lot on rocks. And over time, moss can start to grow everywhere, especially in older forests. They're not only residents of those forests, but they're also creating habitat in those forests for the plants and the seeds and the fungi and the lichens and the slime molds that live in those moss and humus layers. And you can see all kinds of things going on in the moss in this photo. This is actually a picture that I took at Howland Research Forest in Maine with Bob and Monica, I think maybe 2 years ago now. I don't know, a long time ago. But it's a really cool old growth hemlock forest, and I just loved the moss there. So they're building soil, they're holding moisture. That's really important for seed germination, for a lot of little organisms that would desiccate really quickly if they didn't have that moisture layer. And so they're not only residents, they're habitat, and they accrue in layers, and the accrual of moss layers takes time. So moss and liverworts both grow where they'll put up a leafy layer. It will cover the underneath layers, and when those underneath layers stop getting sun, they die back. And so it gets thicker and thicker over time as the annual leaf layers overtop the previous ones. And that's how you start to build soil. You build up this organic matter underneath, decomposers come in and break it down. You've got soil underneath your moss on top of rock that used to be bare rock. So it takes time. It takes a lot of time, a lot more time than humans, time scales that humans aren't used to working on. But this is primary succession. And you've probably heard of forest succession, the somewhat predictable changes in forest stand composition and structure as the forest ages. You might have even witnessed this. You might have a favorite walking trail where then there was a logging event and all of a sudden it's brambles and gray birch where it used to be mature oaks. Or you might have seen the other way around. You might have seen a field that you knew as a kid and gone back and found a thicket of young trees or a few older trees with really big lower limbs and the young ones starting to die off. This is sort of the predictable trajectory of the forest over time. But succession isn't limited to the trees. Everything changes with it. There's even some debate about whether plant succession is driving soil community succession or the other way around. Either way, these communities change over time. And the towering trees, from the towering trees to the springtails to the slime molds, we'll see different ones depending on the age of the forest. Humans are just starting to understand the succession of fungal communities. Old growth forests have old growth fungi. And there's some understanding of moss and lichen succession. You might have heard of indicator species, which are mosses and lichens that you tend to see only in old forests. But we're just sort of starting to understand that. Meanwhile, we have reset the clock, the successional clock, so to speak, on most of our region within the last 2 centuries. Back to basically zero when we cleared for sheep fever and fields and stuff. You know, there are some areas that we know about that lived through that time. There are others that began recovering very early and are now building those structures. But by and large, a lot of our forests have been reset. And this is a chart from an article in the journal Forest Ecology and Management from a paper published in 2002, trying to estimate the natural disturbance regime of northeastern forests. So in our region, the natural disturbance regime, it's usually wind and ice events that sort of govern changes in forest canopy structure and how the forest changes over time. Within the natural disturbance regimes, canopy gaps, that means like holes in the forest canopy. When you're walking underneath the trees, you can start to see pieces of sunlight. They naturally occur when a forest is around 100 years old. And I think you can see my pointer. So that's what we're looking at here. That's when you start to see gaps of 2 or 3 trees, little blowdown events, or they die from disease or something like that. When you start to see stand replacing disturbance, this is like a whole forest area taken down. You're looking at severe wind or fire, and that occurred at a stand replacing level on the order of every 1,000 to 10,000 years. That's what we're looking at here. So within this natural disturbance regime, you'd go quite a long time before you'd see a whole forest replaced. This is orders of magnitude longer than typical timber rotations today, and fragmentation and conversion also increase edges and further reduce the amount of forest that's sort of going through this natural process of getting older. So we've really reset the clock on a lot of our region. This picture, which was the background of that diagram of old forest features that I showed earlier, this one I took maybe 4 or 5 years ago at our Bridgewater Hollow Bramhall Wilderness Preserve. That's a forest that was cleared. There's stone walls in there and a cellar hole and a barn, but it was abandoned around 1850 from what I can tell in my research, and really no management happened of the forest ever since. And you can see that it's starting to accrue those old forest features again. So we're looking at about 175-year-old forest right here. That's pretty young in the lifetime of a forest. This is in Vermont, 175. That's pretty old for most forests in Vermont today. Within this sort of natural disturbance regime, we've kind of, well, no, in our current disturbance regime, we've kind of reset a lot of our forests to like teenage years. And most of what we know as forests today are kind of teenagers. So now to my final question. Why do you care? 81% of New England is forested, yet only 3.3% is considered wildlands. This comes from that Wildlands report that I mentioned earlier. This means that in all of New England, humans have committed to stop turning back the successional clock on really only about 3.3% of the landscape. I wanted to zoom in specifically on Massachusetts. So I pulled the Wildlands Report Massachusetts summary. They found that only 2.3% of the state of Massachusetts is considered wildlands today. And this map is a screenshot there's a great web tool where you can kind of scroll around and look at all of the places that the Wildlands Report found to be protected as wildlands to that definition that I showed earlier. So all those little blue lines meet the definition that I showed earlier. So here comes my call to action. The accrual of old forest structure takes a long time, so long that many of us don't even know what we're missing. Biodiversity includes not just the large and charismatic species, but also the tiny and lesser known ones. The diversity of mosses, lichens, insects, hexapods, protists, and so much more increases with available habitat. And that available habitat increases with time in forests, time and autonomy. We don't know what many of these even are, so we don't even know what we lose when we reset the clock. We don't know what we have already lost when we reset the clock at European colonization. We can choose today to make space for all of life, the weird and the wonderful and the fantastically diverse array of other beings that rely on autonomous nature to live. And we can choose that by investing in wildlands and wildlands conservation to support the rest of that pyramid of biodiversity that I showed earlier. And so with that, I'm done. Thank you so much to Kestrel for having me, and thank you to NEWT for employing me, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate you spending your spring evening with me. I put my email address down there at the bottom in case you want to reach out for any reason. And now I'll hand it back to Marilyn to do some Q&A, I guess.
Okay, wow. Thank you so very much, Shelby. What a fascinating presentation. Yeah, I really like how you focused on the small creatures, which are too often and easily overlooked. And reminded us of the time scales that forests operate on, which are longer and slower than a lot of humans are comfortable with. And yeah, it's hopeful forests can recover if allowed the conditions to do so. Thank you for your call to action and re-emphasizing the importance of conservation and how our work is helping to make space for all creatures, large and small. Okay, so I'm going to start looking at the chat here, and we have some comments and some questions. Shelby, have you seen the studies done in Japan on the slime modes traveling through mazes and mapping the Tokyo subway system? The indication of intelligence here is compelling.
I absolutely have. People send it to me every 6 months or so. I've seen it over and over, and I still find it fascinating. This study that they're talking about, some researchers in Japan put oats, which are often used as slime mold baits, on in a I guess a gel or whatever medium that they had them in the order of the sort of imitating the points of interest in Tokyo. And then the slime molds were able to find the most efficient path between the baits, mimicking the Tokyo subway, which is famously one of the most efficient in the world, I guess. I read this book a few years ago called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And I came away with the conclusion that no, we're not. We constantly try to hold animals and other organisms up to the yardstick of how we decide if we are smart. And it's just different. You know, there's so many other kinds of intelligence out there. And slime molds are a great example of that sort of decentralized intelligence where they still can solve puzzles, they can solve mazes, they can find the most efficient ways to navigate something without any recognizable brain, which is really cool.
Wow, amazing. Okay, we have some hands raised here, Shelby. Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Through. And thank you, Shelby, for a fascinating talk. It's been a long time since I've heard such an enthusiastic endorsement of slime molds. I'm right with you. I think they're arguably smarter than we are, but they're fascinating. I have actually two questions, but the first one has to do with the idea of well, the paucity of old growth habitat and the need for more. but it's actually the pushback against that idea that's coming from some quarters about the effects of an aging forest structure in New England and the disappearance of early successional habitat and the decline in those habitats for species that rely on it. And I've never seen a real good estimate of the amount of successional habitat that there is. I mean, we know that from Forest Service data that the forests are aging. Okay, that's clear. But it seems to me that there's a huge amount of edge habitat, early successional habitat. I'm wondering where NEWT or you come down on this idea that we need to continue to harvest forests to maintain early successional habitat against all the other forces that contribute to that early successional habitat.
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
You know where I'm coming from on that. That's
I agree that I haven't seen a great accounting for where early successional habitat is. You know, I see a lot of opportunity for maintaining early successional habitat in places like power line corridors and old log landings and road networks that are left to rewild, and you know, in old fields in some places. But I also hear a lot of calls to action to manage for that. My caution is that I fear that when we manage too much for early successional, and so we manage a place for early successional, and then that starts to get older, and then we manage this place for early successional, and then that starts to get older, and then we manage this place for early successional. We're moving around and we're not leaving anything alone to get old. If we want to manage something for early successional, I think we should choose an area and continue maintaining that area for early successional, and then choose other places that we are sort of dedicating to this old forest goal. So I think I don't totally understand the balance of where we are, particularly across all of New England. I've done some research in Vermont. I've looked at this in some places, but where I come down is I'm not against anything. I'm for some wild places. And so I think there's room for both. In my presentation, I showed 3.3% of New England is wildlands. I think we can do better. I think we need to do better. I don't think it needs to be 100%. I think there needs to be room for all of these different approaches and for all of the different species that rely on different habitat types. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Shelby. Here's a question in the chat, and then we'll go back to the people with raised hands. Here's a question from Chuck. As we rewild, do you expect that keystone carnivores will need to be reintroduced, like in Yellowstone, or will they return in numbers as the environment makes possible?
Oof, tricky question. I think it will depend very much on the species of carnivore. I think if we do a good enough job with those cores and those corridors, wolves will be back before we know it. They've already found animals that are 96% wolf DNA in the Adirondack Park. There are wolves in Canada. So I think we could see the return of some of those carnivores on their own. We still have some of them as well, by the way, the mesocarnivores like the foxes and the coyotes and the various large weasels, some of whom's populations are faltering, like martens, who rely on these old forests and old forest structures. So I think they will be able to recover on their own as we have more of these wild places. Some other species like cougars, I think there's less hope of them coming back on their own. Some recent science that I've seen shows that there's a lot of downward population pressure on the edges of where they currently live. So they're probably unlikely to make it back this way in an appreciable way without some big intervention. Whether or not humans want to do that is an open question. But I think we could have some of that function back even without that step. We still have bobcats and lynx in New England forests. The lynx are mostly relegated to northern habitats and areas where there's more snow. Bobcats are doing pretty well. So I think we can make room and coexist with our carnivores, and some of them will come back, some of them will recover, and then some of them may not, and then it will be sort of a decision point for us about how well we want to coexist.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Shelby. Yeah, those carnivores certainly have their place in the matrix. Matthew, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Well, first, well, thank you, Shelby. This was a really wonderful presentation, and I love the photography. I can definitely see myself putting all that on the back of a desktop sometime. But my question was in relation to in the same vein of kind of like introduction of carnivores or intervention of some type, and specifically in relation to kind of invasive species, like and how. Like, where is the kind of like, it sounds like you don't operate in terms of absolutes, but where's the right amount of management that comes in of kind of like where you let rewilding take place and kind of nature at the forefront versus kind of where introduced species might threaten the biodiversity of a given area, and kind of where that measuring stick kind of lies. And I just was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, boy, you guys are full of the hard questions tonight. Invasive species is a really, really tricky one. And I have spent a lot of time in the last year or two researching this, and where I have come down is not a very popular opinion, which is that we currently don't do anything to manage terrestrial herbaceous invasive species on our properties. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that a lot of these species get their competitive edge from disturbance. And our whole management philosophy is sort of ending that human disturbance. And so our hope is that they will lose some of that edge over time as the forests kind of close in and the canopies close and recover. And then maybe the native species will get a little bit of a leg up from that. The other is that I have for a while now been struggling with a lot of the rhetoric that we use in conservation around invasive species, and how we are teaching people that there's good nature and bad nature, and how like when I was kind of growing up into conservation, when I was a little wee baby conservationist, my sort of, I call it the gateway drug to conservation, is like a weed pull, where they want you to come pull invasive species, and they talk about these evil weeds and how we need to rip them out. And I think we're there's going to be consequences of that kind of talk and activity, and of introducing an entire new generation of conservationists who are really, really interventionist, that we haven't yet seen play out. I remember I did the field naturalist program at UVM, and a couple years ago, many years ago now, I went to the like open house or whatever and had dinner with the students after, and probably about half of the people applying for the program had done internships or spent time pulling weeds, and just had such vitriol. And they were like, oh, these things, they're horrible, they're nasty, they're the only reason I would ever consider pouring, you know, pesticides and poison in places. And it just changed something in me. I just thought, like, I'm not sure this is the right message. And so I'm kind of alone in this belief. There's not a lot of people standing behind me, but I've done some research. I can't find a lot of evidence of terrestrial herbaceous invasive species actually driving extinctions, particularly on large continents. If we're talking about islands, it's a different thing, but on the mainland, they're here, they're intermixing. Things, the arc of these things is long. Talking about timescales again, like numbers go up, but there's a saturation point where our sort of local wildlife and insect communities are going to learn that these things are edible. And I think we'll start to see them arc back down. I just read this fascinating book called The Light Eaters about plant intelligence. And she talked about how invasive species are probably just really plastic. like they're just really adaptive, and they are able to kind of work with whatever they've got. And I've seen this too, where they all seem to come from places where there seems to be a lot of you know, their competitive edge is like really tied to sort of constant human intervention of some kind. They're all up and down the highway medians, there are road corridors, there are trail corridors, so we see them all the time. Bushwhack around off trail for a while. I mean, be thoughtful, don't bring the seeds, but spend some time off trail and in deep woods, and you just don't see them. We did forest plots on our Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve at 6,000 acres in central Vermont. It's a timber property, there's logging roads everywhere. I put 20 points in a random grid across the entire thing. We went to every one and made a full species list of a 20 meter by 20 meter plot. We didn't find a single invasive species. My goal was to track how these invasive species act in a rewilding forest, and I didn't find any because it was just isolated enough. We were just far enough away from the roads, and they are there, they're along the roads, but you know, spend some time away from where vehicles go, where recreationists with wheels go, and you get away from a lot of them. So my philosophy right now is do nothing. I may live to regret it, but we're going to watch and see what happens on our properties, and it will be a learning opportunity for everyone. There's not a lot of science about what they do in unmanaged environments when left totally alone. I don't think we'll ever get a handle on the ones in stream corridors like Japanese knotweed, because that is an sort of inherently dynamic environment. There's constant disturbance from streams, so we're not going to beat that. What might happen is native wildlife might start eating them. They are, especially in Vermont after Irene in 2011 and then the floods last July, they're everywhere. Their entire river corridors are just knotweed now for, you know, miles and miles. So we're going to see what happens with that in a big way. I don't think we're going to win the fight, and I don't think pesticides are the answer. If people want to pull them, you know, on their own land or their conservation land, it's totally appropriate. But I don't think wildlands are the place to manage them. So currently we don't. Very long-winded answer.
No,
Thank you,
That was
Shelby.
very
Yeah, very thoughtful, very big picture. I appreciate your what are we for versus what are we against approach. And let's see, somebody here, Mac23, also is saying you are not alone. Many of us do not agree with the aggressive and dualistic orientation towards these species, both plants and animals. Thanks for being a strong voice in conservation to bring this entrenched perspective to question. So yeah, big picture, longer time frame, trust in the life process of the whole system. Okay, Sean, you have a question and your hand is raised. Would you like to? Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate Matthew's question. My question was largely in the same vein as that, but it raised another question I had, which was I was canoeing around the other day with a friend, and we were just commenting on how, you know, 400 years ago, the amount of like massed food in our forests, between, you know, the amount of butternuts and chestnuts and things like that that are just no longer there, the amount of suitable habitat for some of our, you know, creatures that depend on that is just gone. And I wondered if you guys, so like, I understand the idea around invasive species management and, you know, looking at the timescales of, you know, 1,000, 10,000 years into the future, how in some ways it comes out in the wash as things co-evolve. I'm wondering about any kind of like ecological roles that have disappeared over the last couple of years that we can't get back. And like the one that came to mind was like the loss of mast trees and what that means for biodiversity. I'm wondering if you've thought of other examples like that, and your thoughts on what that means for our forests and how NEWT is thinking about you know, what sort of roles old forests are creating that have been gone for a long time, or what things that are are gone and not coming back, and what that means.
Just a little question, really simple. Yeah, gosh. So I think these things, there's no easy answer. There's no simple way to think about any of this. And things aren't really interchangeable in the way that I want them to be. But I will say that, you know, we've lost a lot of butternuts, we've lost a lot of chestnuts. We also have more beech than we used to have. Now, beech bark disease is a big thing, but the killing front is past. We have tons of beech sprout. It remains to be seen whether they will get big enough to produce nuts like the older trees, but there is some hope there. I also think, you know, this is maybe a little bit of a pessimistic take, I guess, but as climate change warms, more and more of our northern New England is going to be suitable habitat for oaks, which are great mass producers. So those will replace some of the missing mass producers. And I think it'll be a long time before we lose oaks to, well, who knows, you know, forest pests are coming all the time, but hopefully we don't lose the mass trees that we have. I read this paper, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the citation, but a couple months ago, we do this like lunch and learn in the office where we read these articles and discuss them. And one of my colleagues read this paper about pollen cores and tree species composition over time. And one of the things he noted in that paper was that in some of these, like going back, you know, thousands of years pollen core studies, they found that certain tree species did wink out. In fact, hemlock disappeared for an extended period and returned. And so things like those forest pests, like beech bark disease, like hemlock woolly adelgid, that are sort of wreaking havoc on these trees that have really major implications for all the things that rely on them, thinking about, you know, all the things that co-evolved in shady hemlock forests, or all the things that need the mast from these mass producing species. You know, we're all really sad thinking about losing those things, but having that sort of longer timescale perspective, I think extinction is probably not the outcome. I think change is the outcome, right? We're going to have a lot less of them, or much smaller ones. Like, we still have elms everywhere. Dutch elm disease did not kill elms. It just killed the big ones. We have little tiny ones everywhere, and they die when they get to a certain size. And I think we'll probably see the same thing with ash trees. We are seeing something similar with beech trees. So all of these things, they have sort of these built-in fail-safes where the trees don't go away. They just sort of linger in the background for a period of time. They become a less substantial component of the forest. And then in the grand scheme of things, they may eventually be able to develop resistance to the disease or whatever the pest was that wiped them out. Even chestnuts are still around. There's chestnut stands here. There's a chestnut stand on a Northeast Wilderness Trust preserve in Maine. And baby chestnuts are sprouting from that preserve all the time. Blight is around, it's coming, but there are young chestnuts in the forest. So I think it's really tempting to be pretty defeatist about these things, but I think there's a lot more resilience than we give these systems credit for. And it's going to be hard to see, and it's going to be painful, like particularly in the coming years. I am just sort of thinking about the invasive species question, and also about the forest pests. Like, I love our natural communities. I love the northern forest and the transition forests of southern New England. I know these communities and the members of them, and I consider them my home and my friends, and they're going to change. But nature is never not changing. And so I worry that we get really caught up in this moment, or in this idea of what nature was supposed to be when we first started tracking it, or something like that. But there are times in history when continents touched for the first time. So invasive species, they're not a new phenomenon. this sort of movement of species has always happened. We're doing a lot of movement at a pace that is unprecedented right now. So it's very scary. We are going to lose some things. There's no way around it. It's really sad to watch, but I have to hope that there's more resilience there than we can see. And I have to hope that communities will recover and that many of the cast of characters are going to make it through, but they might look different on the other side. In fact, I know they're going to look different on the other side, and they're going to continue to look different forever. And that's just nature. That's how it works.
Good answer, Shelby. Thanks for reminding us that nature is never not changing. Yeah, and that it's a very resilient system. Okay, there's a response from Elisa. She says in Massachusetts, the beech leaf disease seems to be killing the beech sprouts.
Right. Beech leaf disease is another one. That is somewhat, well, my understanding is that it's somewhat climate limited. So it's mostly southern New England and coastal now. For now, it's not making it into interior northern New England. That's not going to last in the face of climate change, but at least for now, we have a reprieve from it. We can find hope.
Absolutely. Thank you. Peter, do you have another question there? I see your hand raised.
Well, I do. Thank you. And those are great perspectives, Shelby. I'm a forest ecologist myself, and what we're struggling with is a basic mismatch between the human timescale and ecological timescales. And it's a hard sell for people if you say, oh, just wait 200 years, things will be different for sure. Those invasive species may reduce their abundances, but it is a hard sell, and people want to see even if you say wait 5 or 8 years or 10 years, that's still too long. And so you're often grappling with this need for something that will restore systems to something that we're used to within our time frame, not appreciating the fact that these forests are fundamentally different than they were 200 years ago or 250 years ago. But that's not my question. Goes back actually to the point, as we think about climate change, and something that's very current in certain ecological areas is assisted migration. And so as we think about the rapidity of climate change and the pace of species migrations, particularly tree species, there is a fundamental mismatch there. Does wildlands rewilding, is there a role for assisted migration in rewilding efforts? I guess is my question. People like to think about this, and there's a lot of modeling that's been done about species that would do better. You mentioned oaks and so forth. Should we be planting southern oaks, in reclaimed lands, or for that matter, just anticipating the climate change stressors?
So another tough one. I think where I come down on that is one of the arguments that I often make for wildlands is that they make a great baseline. So we're not doing manipulations. We're not doing, it's the no management strategy, right? We're not doing that sort of restoration work generally. We're not doing invasive species work. And so my belief in is that in wildlands, we probably should not be doing that assisted migration piece either. But I'm not saying that no one should. There may be places where that's appropriate and where people think through the potential repercussions and decide it's the right move. And then wilderness and wildlands can be the baseline to which we compare to see if it's successful, right? I think having those unmanipulated landscapes helps us to see whether or not our manipulations are having the desired impacts. And without the unmanipulated landscape, we can't really know that. We can't really know if the outcome was the result of what we did or if something similar would have happened if we had done nothing. So I think we say no to the assisted migration, but that doesn't mean there's no place for it anywhere. It just means that, you know, we're serving a different set of values on these wildlands.
Oh, thank you. And I hope you're right about the low temperature break on the beech leaf disease, because it's breaking my heart. It's all over central Massachusetts now, and it's all over the Cape, and it's so rapid. This wasn't here 2 years ago, and now all those poor beech, which are already blemished by bark disease, are going to be dead in 2 years. So it's a heartbreaker.
Oof.
Maybe up in Maine there'll be a reprieve. We'll see what happens. Thank you.
We hope.
Thank you for that question, Peter. Here's another question in the chat, Shelby. Do you think the missing piece of Indigenous land stewardship practices like controlled burns affects how the land rewilds?
Certainly. Yeah, I think changes in management, or, you know, styles of management, has an impact on how the land changes. I think Indigenous burning was certainly more common in southern New England than in northern New England, though it did occur in areas up here. So I think the impact is not evenly spread on the landscape. But I do think, yeah, it certainly has an impact on the way rewilding occurs. I also think forests don't necessarily need that manipulation to turn into old, rich, diverse communities with structures and habitat values that are important. So I think there's, you know, nature has existed with people and without people for millennia, and you'll get different versions depending on what you put in. So I really struggle with thinking about the differences now between the rewilding that we're talking about and so some of those sort of missing practices on the landscape. And one of the things that I sort of, I don't know, tell myself to feel better, I guess, is that the practices that were used are still used in some places, and in some places they are not necessary, and in some places they never were. And so it kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier about sort of not doing the backward looking preservation idea, and sort of looking forward at what these communities can come in our current day environment and our current set of conditions. We're just looking at a different set of variables, and so we're going to get different outcomes with or without Indigenous land stewardship, with or without management. These things are just ever changing. So I think now we're in a place where the human footprint has spread so much that I think wildlands are really important to commit to places where nature directs the ebb and flow of life. I don't think they're the only important thing. I think there's a balance, and I think some of those practices could be and should be practiced on other land, but I think just dealing with the modern economic and different pressures that our land is facing, I think it's important to have places that are unmanipulated.
Okay, Shelby. Let's see, we have room or time for about one or two more questions, and it looks like Elisa, you have your hand raised. Too many people need wild places, but it's hard to keep people out.
I mean, I think it's really important to keep in mind the perspective that on that pyramid that I showed of all the different kinds of life, humans are part of that little tiny red triangle on the very top. And yet we have altered the surface of the earth to such an extent as to equal some of those larger pieces on the bottom. And so I agree with Elisa there that we just need to make some places for some other things. And it's hard to do. It's hard to think about because human justice is also really important. And I want humans to have access to nature and wildlife, and that matters so much. And so many land trusts do that work, right? Do that human-focused work, getting people out on the land. North Branch Nature Centers here, they do tons of really wonderful education and hands-on on the land stuff. And so I'll just come back to saying, we're not against anything, but we're for wildlands. There needs to be some peace where we let the other 99.99% of beings live in peace.
Nicely said, Shelby. We're at the 7:30 mark, but I just want to ask Bob and Monica Leverett, do you have any questions or any comments? And thanks again so much for joining us in your support of Wildlands.
There.
Okay, our question is, when are you coming down to see us again?
I know next time I do, I need to bring a pie, right? I owe you some pies, Bob.
You do indeed. Well, one point or question, I think you have made incredible points, very good. Would you say something just for my benefit about the carbon? Just to make me happy.
I will. Carbon accrues during a tree's entire life, and older trees store more carbon on an individual basis than many, many, many younger trees. And if you want to see the mathematics behind that, Bob Leverett is your man. He has a spreadsheet that will tell you exactly how many small trees it takes to make up one large tree. And it is very fascinating.
Thank you, Shelby.
Well said. Thanks for the shout out to Bob and Monica. Okay, one last question, and it's a hard one, according to the chat here. One last hard question, Shelby. How do you suggest we work with DCR and other state and national agencies to promote wildlands?
Well, public lands belong to you. They belong to all of us. So there are many ways to use your voice to talk about what you want to see on your public lands. We don't do any advocacy as an organization, but I encourage people who believe in wildlands to do their own advocacy for their own local public lands and, make their voice heard. I think people don't realize how few people actually speak up in a lot of those public comment periods. There are really very few voices showing up there. And if you add yours to the pile, you might just tilt the outcome in a meaningful way. So I do I take my NEWT hat off and put on my personal Shelby hat. I follow the management planning efforts for the state forests that are around me. And when those plans go out for public comment, I comment on them. I fill out the form or I call them and I give them my thoughts because I think it's important. That's part of the process. They want to hear from you. They need to hear from you. They're required to try to hear from you. And if you tell them what you want to see on your public lands, whatever that may be, that voice goes into all the other voices they're hearing from, and that's how they make the decisions about what they're going to do on those public lands. So use your voice and your votes.
Outstanding. What a positive note to end on. They are our public lands. Raise your voice. Use your voice as a voting mechanism. Okay, with that, I just want to say on behalf of Kestrel Land Trust, Thank you so much for participating in this online speaker series. Let's give a shout out to Shelby again for an outstanding presentation. Thanks for joining us. We love our partnership with Northeast Wilderness Trust. Thanks again, Bob and Monica Leverett, for your outstanding work and for joining us. And if you have any suggestions for other online speakers or topics, feel free to let me know. And we'll see you again online. Have a good night, and get outside and enjoy nature and find those wildlands if you can.
Thank you, everyone.